The emperor's head rolls across the muddy ground, eyes still open, jaw slack. Around it, legionaries cheer, not in horror, but in celebration. They've just ended their own commander's reign. Within hours, they'll crown another. Within months, they'll remove him too. It's March 235, and the Roman Empire, master of the known world for 3 centuries, has just crossed a threshold from which it will never truly return. What happens next isn't a sudden collapse. It's something worse, a slow unraveling that will consume an entire generation. An empire of 80 million people, stretching from the Scottish Highlands to the deserts of Mesopotamia, is about to discover just how quickly order can dissolve. This is the decade that nearly ended Rome. For 200 years, the Roman Empire had operated on a simple but powerful principle. The emperor ruled until death, and power passed through established channels, either bloodline or Senate approval. The system wasn't perfect. Transitions were sometimes violent, conspiracies were common, and palace intrigue was a constant. But they followed a pattern. There were rules. There was a framework that everyone understood. On March 18, 235, those rules shattered completely. Emperor Severus Alexander, 26 years old, educated, cautious, and deeply influenced by his mother, had been negotiating with Germanic tribes along the Rhine frontier. His soldiers, hardened by years of constant warfare and bitter cold, viewed negotiation as weakness. They wanted plunder, not peace. They wanted a warrior on the throne, not a diplomat. When Alexander offered gold to the tribes instead of battle, the legions made their decision. They struck him down in his tent. Along with him, they removed his mother, Julia Mamaea, who had effectively ruled through her son for over a decade. The Severan dynasty, which had governed Rome for 42 years and provided a sense of continuity across the empire, ended in minutes. The soldiers immediately proclaimed their own choice: Maximinus Thrax, a career soldier of peasant origin, possibly born beyond the empire's borders in Thrace. He was enormous, reportedly standing over 7 feet tall. He'd never held political office. He'd never set foot in the Roman Senate. He'd never even entered Rome itself. None of that mattered anymore. What the legions had discovered, and what would poison the empire for the next 50 years, was that they could make emperors, and unmake them just as easily. The only qualification needed was the loyalty of armed men. And loyalty, as it turned out, could be bought or taken, or simply evaporated when the next crisis emerged. Within 3 years, Maximinus fell too, removed by his own soldiers during a failed siege of Aquileia. His successors lasted months, sometimes weeks. One emperor, Gordian I, ruled for 22 days before taking his own life in despair after his son's defeat. His son, proclaimed co-emperor, had fallen in battle the same day against forces loyal to Maximinus. The Senate, desperate to assert control and restore civilian authority, appointed 2 replacements simultaneously, Pupienus and Balbinus. Both were gone within months, removed by the Praetorian Guard in a palace confrontation. The throne had become a death sentence. And yet, men kept reaching for it. But here's what makes this period so devastating, and what separates it from ordinary political turmoil. It wasn't just chaos at the top. Every fallen emperor triggered a cascading crisis that rippled through every layer of Roman society, from senators in marble halls to farmers on distant frontiers. Each new claimant needed to secure loyalty immediately. That meant bonuses for the army, massive payments in gold and silver that drained the imperial treasury. To replenish the coffers, emperors debased the currency, mixing cheap metals into silver coins until the coins were barely worth the metal they contained. By 238, Roman currency had lost more than half its value compared to a decade earlier. By the mid-240s, the decline was accelerating beyond recovery. Inflation exploded across every province. A measure of wheat that cost 8 denarii in 235 cost 16 by 240, and the price kept climbing. Soldiers, whose pay was now practically worthless, demanded more bonuses, forcing further debasement. Merchants raised prices to compensate. The cycle accelerated with no mechanism to stop it. Traders stopped accepting Roman coin at face value. Trade networks that had connected Britain to Syria, that had carried olive oil from Spain to the legions on the Danube, began contracting. Cities that had thrived on commerce for centuries watched their markets empty. The complex economic system that had sustained 80 million people, the largest integrated economy the ancient world had ever seen, started to seize up. And while Rome removed its own emperors one after another, its enemies were watching with growing confidence. The Persian Sasanian Empire, recently revitalized under the ambitious Shapur I, saw opportunity in Rome's dysfunction. In 238, Persian forces swept into Roman Mesopotamia, capturing fortress cities that hadn't fallen in 2 centuries. Shapur didn't just raid. He annexed territory permanently, establishing control over lands Rome considered eternal possessions. It was the beginning of a Persian resurgence that would humiliate Rome for decades. On the northern frontiers, Germanic tribes intensified their pressure dramatically. The Alemanni crossed the Rhine in force. The Goths appeared on the Danube, a powerful new confederation testing Roman defenses at multiple points simultaneously. These weren't the scattered raids Rome had managed for generations with relative ease. These were coordinated probing attacks against an empire that was visibly, undeniably weakening. Roman commanders, distracted by civil wars and lacking consistent imperial support or clear chains of command, fought desperate holding actions with dwindling resources. Frontiers that had been stable for a century became active war zones. Legions that should have been defending the borders were instead marching on Rome, pursuing the latest usurper's bid for power. The machinery of empire was cannibalizing itself. But what did this actually mean for the people living through it? The senators and generals appear in our sources, but what about the millions who left no names behind? In cities like Antioch, Alexandria, and Carthage, daily life became unpredictable in ways that would have been unthinkable a generation earlier. Tax collectors appeared with increasing frequency, demanding payments in gold or goods since the currency was worthless. Local magistrates, appointed by emperors who were now dead, tried to maintain order with unclear authority. When a new emperor took power, would their previous decisions be honored? Would they face consequences for serving the wrong regime? No one could say. Many simply fled. Archaeological evidence from this period shows urban populations declining significantly, particularly in frontier regions. People moved to the countryside, to estates owned by powerful landlords who could provide the protection that the state no longer guaranteed. They traded freedom for security, a bargain that would echo through centuries. This wasn't a conscious transformation. It was survival, one family at a time. But in making these choices, millions of Romans were inadvertently building the feudal structure that would define medieval Europe. The connection between citizen and empire, the civic identity that had made Rome functional for 3 centuries, was dissolving like salt in water. For soldiers, the situation was even more complex and demoralizing. Legionaries joined for 25-year careers with the promise of land and citizenship upon retirement. But what happened when the emperor who recruited you was dead? When the successor refused to honor promises made by a man he'd helped remove? When your pay was worthless, your equipment deteriorating, and your commanders were more interested in politics than defending the frontier you were bleeding on? Many soldiers made a rational calculation. Personal loyalty to their immediate general became more important than abstract duty to Rome. They weren't betraying the empire. The empire had betrayed them first by becoming incoherent. This is how armies became personal retinues, how generals became warlords, how the Roman military, the most sophisticated fighting force the ancient world had ever created, transformed into something more primitive and fractured. Women and children faced their own quiet catastrophes. In frontier zones overrun by invading forces, families were scattered, displaced, or lost entirely. The sources from this period, admittedly fragmentary and incomplete, record entire communities vanishing from the historical record. One inscription marks a thriving town. The next entry, silence. That silence itself is evidence of what was lost. In one documented case from 238, the city of Istris on the Black Sea was devastated by Carpi raiders. The city had stood for 600 years as a center of Greek and then Roman civilization. It never fully recovered. Multiply that by dozens of cities across thousands of miles of frontier, and you begin to grasp the scale of human displacement. The psychological impact is harder to measure but perhaps more significant than any material loss. Romans had believed their empire was eternal, ordained by the gods, destined to rule the world until the end of time. That certainty, the foundation of Roman identity and civic life, was crumbling visibly. The gods, it seemed, had abandoned them, or perhaps Rome had abandoned the gods. By 244, the empire had cycled through at least 8 recognized emperors in 9 years, with countless usurpers and pretenders falling in obscurity across the provinces. The latest survivor was Philip the Arab, an equestrian from Syria who'd risen through military ranks and secured power through careful maneuvering. He would survive 5 years, a relative success in this bloody period, largely by avoiding the frontiers and focusing on spectacle and diplomacy. In 248, Philip celebrated Rome's 1000th anniversary with magnificent games, exotic animals from Africa and Asia, and theatrical displays that recalled the empire's former glory. It was propaganda on a grand scale, an attempt to project continuity and strength to a population desperate for reassurance. But the citizens watching the spectacles in the Colosseum knew the truth beneath the pageantry. The borders were collapsing. The currency was worthless. The throne was cursed. The damage inflicted during this single decade would take generations to address. Some of it never was. The military reforms that eventually stabilized Rome, larger armies, mobile field forces, fortified defense in depth, were direct responses to the failures exposed during this crisis. The administrative changes under Diocletian, who would split the empire into multiple jurisdictions 40 years later, came from recognizing that no single authority could manage the chaos that 235 to 245 had unleashed. Even the conversion to Christianity, which would transform Roman civilization forever, has roots here. As traditional Roman religion failed to explain or prevent the catastrophe, people sought new answers, new sources of meaning. The mystery cults and Eastern religions that flourished during this desperate period laid the groundwork for Christianity's eventual triumph. The Roman Empire that emerged from the 3rd century crisis was not the same state that entered it. It was more militarized, more authoritarian, more bureaucratic, and more fragmented. The confident, expansive, cosmopolitan empire of the Antonines was gone forever. What survived was tougher, more rigid, but smaller in spirit and vision. There's a detail from 238 that stays with me long after the broader narrative fades. During the brief joint reign of Pupienus and Balbinus, the Senate's last desperate attempt to restore civilian order, the two emperors couldn't cooperate. Ancient sources describe them living in the same imperial palace, but refusing to eat together, each fearing the other would tamper with his food. While they argued over protocol and precedence, the Praetorian Guard simply walked in and removed them both. It's almost absurd, but it captures something essential about this decade, something that transcends ancient Rome entirely. Institutions only function when people believe in them. The moment that belief evaporates, when emperors can be made by any army with enough swords, when currency is just metal with a meaningless stamp, when borders are suggestions rather than barriers, everything built on those institutions becomes vulnerable. Everything. Rome had spent centuries building a system of laws, trade, administration, and military power unmatched in human history. In 10 years, it learned how quickly belief can collapse, how fragile order actually is beneath its confident surface, how close civilization always stands to the edge of chaos. The empire survived, but it survived profoundly changed, carrying scars it would never fully heal. And if you think this is just ancient history, just distant chaos irrelevant to the modern world, consider how quickly our own certainties can evaporate, how fast institutions we think are permanent can become hollow, how easily belief, once lost, proves nearly impossible to recover. The men who removed Severus Alexander in that muddy camp along the Rhine thought they were solving a problem. They couldn't have imagined they were opening an abyss that would swallow a generation. History doesn't repeat, but it echoes. And sometimes, in the silence between those echoes, we can hear warnings that were always meant for us.